Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third in our series of lessons that are in honor of Women's History Month. We will be talking about the third mother. This is based on the book of The Three Mothers by Anna Tubbs, in which the book celebrates Black motherhood by telling the story of the three women who raised some very influential people in America: Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and James Baldwin. And if you haven't seen them, I urge you to go check out the sessions on Martin Luther King's mother, Alberta King, and Malcolm X's mother, Louise Little. Today, we are going to be talking about the mother of James Baldwin. And her name was Berdis Baldwin. She was a very artistic soul. She was born in Maryland in 1902. And she lost her mother at a pretty early age. And in this pain, she really grasped onto the love of her siblings and her father. And she became quite an optimistic person about learning how to get through hard times, particularly with the support of loved ones. And everyone later on in her family, when they would talk about her, they would refer to the word love. This is really what she represented. She used to use writing to help other people find that light in dark times that had really helped her. And particularly, she would write about how to get through the tough times in relation to the pain caused by the Jim Crow laws in the South at that time. Because remember, this was in Maryland at the beginning of the last century. So she wrote a lot. She wasn't a published author, but she was always writing letters to the people in her lives that were important to her on birthdays and for other events. And these letters were filled with her life lessons. And these letters became really valuable to her family members, and it became quite a tradition for them. In the early 1900s, Berdis was still just a teenager, but as a part of the Great Migration, the Great Migration was a wave of Black people moving from the South to the northern states around that time. Berdis moved to Philadelphia and then to New York. And her motivation for moving was that she was believed there was more in the world out there for her and what was available for her in Maryland. She moved in the middle of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a movement that really changed life, and particularly Black life in America in many ways. Berdis gave birth to her first child, James, as a single mother, and the father was never known. When James was born, he was given her maiden name at the time, so James Arthur Jones was his name. She later married a minister named David Baldwin, but they had a pretty rough time of it because both Berdis and her husband David had moved north away from their home and family and their support systems. So they had some struggles there. And what made it worse is that David also suffered from mental illness, although his family wasn't aware of this for many years. But over time, his preaching began to fill with much more anger, and he became consumed with the thought that he was being treated as less than human as a Black man and not given the opportunities he deserved. And sadly, he took that anger he had out on his children, and particularly James, as James was his stepson and not his birth son. David would criticize James and hit him and call him names, and James began to believe the horrible things that his stepfather was always saying about him. Many years later, just before David died, Berdis asked James to visit his stepfather to offer him forgiveness. Because remember, she was this loving person, and that was really what was important to her. And she really hoped that James wouldn't hold on to the anger and pain after the death of his father, David. And this really left a big impression on James. He saw that his family and what they had been through, they were just one example of what most Black families really were going through at that time. In an interview later, he talked about the pain and anger that was caused by Black people being treated as less than human, and the impact that had on Black families. So he really did have an empathy with his stepfather, in spite of all the way he had been treated by him as a child, and the condition that he was in his mental illness, and all that he was going through and had to deal with trying to raise a family at that time. And Berdis, his mother, is really palpable in James's words. Berdis always encouraged James to forgive and to look for love and happiness. And he really took that message to heart with his own stepfather in that instance, and in general in his life. It was in 1948 that James moved to Paris. And his mother was very sad, but she was supportive and understanding. And because it followed her path of having to leave home and go far away to pursue opportunity when she was younger. So she really understood. And she didn't want to hold James back in any way, and especially didn't want him held back in the way that she was held back when she was younger. So James moved to Paris, and he really found his voice there, and that's where he became a prolific writer. He lived into his 60s, but he was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and that was ultimately what led to his death. One of his final wishes before he died was to hear his mother's voice before he passed, because he was still in Paris. So he spoke to her on the phone from Paris just days before he died. And Berdis, his mother, was stunned to live past her own son. Most mothers shouldn't have to live through the death of their children. So that must have been pretty difficult for her. But there was a certain peace that she felt in that she could see the peace and change that was brought about by James' writing and his work, and this peace and change that he brought to the whole world. And so that was a real comfort to her. Berdis lived until 1999, not that long ago, 24 years ago. Their son's death, of course, must have been really difficult for her. She really did find some peace from the fact that there was this great movement brought about by her son. And in part, this great movement was brought about through the gift that she gave him through writing. And she used that to remember him and who he was with his nieces and nephews, and really to the whole world. What she specifically left behind, of course, part her son's writings, because that was in part due to her, but she also her children and grandchildren, many of whom are still alive, believe that she was the most important person in their family. It was not just James that she encouraged to be creative, but all 9 of her children became artists in some way. And she was the one who showed all of them, everyone in the family, and her children, and later her grandchildren. She showed them all what peace, hope, forgiveness, happiness, what that looks like in this world. And when Baldwin said, "He is a witness to the power of light," he is directly quoting his mother. Those were actually originally his mother's words. Berdis's descendants are always trying to find ways to keep honoring the tradition that she passed on to them. They continued the tradition of letter writing, so they wrote letters of their own. And they also honored her and tried to carry through her amazing spirit by seeing the world differently and appreciating the light we can bring to the world and the stories we tell. So that is all about Berdis Baldwin, a wonderful way to end this little mini series on the 3 mothers. And I can't wait to actually read the book. Once again, that's by Anna Tubbs. And yeah, so I don't know what we have in store for next week, because we'll no longer be doing the Women's History Month series, but I'll find something good. So have a great week, and I'll see you next time.